Have you ever had that moment when you realize the person signing your paycheck is actually your worst enemy? I certainly did. The revelation hit me like a thunderbolt on a Tuesday afternoon as I watched my boss, Richard Walsh, take credit for my quarterly report during the executive meeting. That was the exact moment I knew. This wasn't just workplace politics. This was war. I'd never considered myself vindictive. In fact, for 32 years, I prided myself on being reasonable, level-headed Michael Turner, the guy who brought homemade cookies to office potlucks, the colleague who remembered birthdays, the team player who stayed late without complaint. But that Tuesday changed everything, and it was about to change Richard Walsh too. He just didn't know it yet. My story isn't just about revenge, it's about justice in a corporate world where the rulebook favors those at the top. It's about what happens when a good person is pushed too far. And most importantly, it's about how I orchestrated the most satisfying professional downfall North Star Solutions had ever seen, without ever once breaking the law. Let me tell you how it all unfolded. I joined North Star Solutions 5 years ago as a senior financial analyst. The company specialized in supply chain management software for mid-sized manufacturers. Not exactly the stuff of dreams, but the pay was good, the benefits better, and my coworkers were decent people. For the first 3 years, I reported to Samantha Klein, a brilliant manager who knew how to bring out the best in her team. Under her leadership, I thrived, even earning 2 promotions. Everything changed when Samantha left for a VP position at a competitor. The company brought in Richard Walsh to replace her, a decision that would prove catastrophic for team morale and, eventually, for Richard himself. From day one, Richard made it clear he wasn't interested in continuing Samantha's collaborative management style. "I'm not here to be your friend," he announced in his first team meeting. "I'm here to get results." His salt and pepper hair was always impeccably styled, his suits expensive and perfectly tailored, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Initially, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. New leaders often want to establish authority. I reasoned, he'll settle in. But as weeks turned into months, Richard's true nature emerged. He was that particular brand of corporate monster who rises by standing on the necks of others. The first major incident occurred 3 months after his arrival. I'd developed a new financial modeling system that reduced forecast errors by 22%, a significant improvement that would save the company millions. I shared the prototype with Richard, hoping for his support to implement it company-wide. "This is interesting," he said, flipping through my presentation with barely concealed disinterest. "Leave it with me. I'll review it properly and get back to you." 2 weeks later. I watched in stunned silence as Richard presented my system to the executive team as his own innovation. He'd made cosmetic changes to the interface and rebranded it as the Walsh Forecasting Framework. The executives were impressed. Richard received a standing ovation and, later that quarter, a substantial bonus. When I confronted him privately, his response chilled me. "Prove it," he said with a smirk. "It's your word against mine, and frankly, Michael, no one at the executive level even knows who you are." He straightened his designer tie. "That's how the game is played. You should be thanking me for implementing your idea at all." I walked away seething, but determined to be strategic. This wasn't a battle I could win with direct confrontation. Richard had connections, power, and the ear of the CEO. I was just another worker bee in a company of hundreds. For the next several months, I documented everything, every email, every meeting, every assignment. I began making duplicate copies of all my work, storing them on personal drives with timestamps. I wasn't sure what I'd do with this evidence, but instinct told me to create a paper trail. Meanwhile, Richard's behavior worsened. He took credit not just for my work, but for everyone's on the team. He implemented brutal performance metrics that had people working nights and weekends. 3 talented team members quit within 2 months. Those who remained walked around with permanent stress lines etched into their faces. The second major incident happened during annual performance reviews. Despite exceeding all my targets and bringing in a major client, Richard gave me a meets expectations rating, disqualifying me from the annual bonus structure. "You're just not showing the leadership qualities we need at your level," he explained, not bothering to look up from his phone during our review meeting. "What specific leadership qualities am I missing?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. He finally looked up, annoyed at being questioned. "Initiative, strategic thinking, the ability to see the big picture. All qualities I'd demonstrated repeatedly, particularly with the forecasting system he'd stolen." That night, I went home and poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey. As I sat on my balcony overlooking the city lights, a calm clarity washed over me. Richard Walsh wasn't going to change. The company wasn't going to intervene. If I wanted justice, I would have to orchestrate it myself. But how do you take down someone like Richard? Direct accusations would fail. He was too protected, too valued by upper management. Going to HR was useless. They existed to protect the company, not me. Quitting would only mean Richard won. No, this would require something more sophisticated. A long game. I needed to understand Richard better than he understood himself. I needed to identify his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities, his pressure points. And then I needed to apply pressure so subtly that he would never see me coming. The next day at work, I arrived with a new demeanor. Gone was the frustrated, demoralized Michael. In his place was a model employee, helpful, enthusiastic, and seemingly devoted to supporting Richard's success. My new approach wasn't just an act. It was the first move in a carefully planned strategy. "Good morning, Richard," I said cheerfully, placing a coffee on his desk, prepared exactly how he liked it. "I've organized those quarterly reports you needed and summarized the key findings. Also, I took the liberty of drafting some talking points for your presentation to the board tomorrow." He looked surprised but pleased. "Well, this is proactive of you. Just trying to be a team player." I replied with a smile that matched his in insincerity. "I've been reflecting on our performance discussion, and you made some valid points about taking more initiative." Over the next few weeks, I made myself indispensable to Richard. I anticipated his needs, solved problems before they reached his desk, and provided him with meticulously prepared analysis that made him shine in executive meetings, all while documenting every instance of his taking credit for my work. But that was just the public-facing part of my plan. Behind the scenes, I was conducting a different kind of work altogether. First, I cultivated relationships throughout the company: IT, HR, finance, even the maintenance staff. People often underestimate how much power support staff wield in an organization. The security guard who sees who comes and goes at odd hours, the IT technician who knows which websites you visit, the administrative assistant who handles your expense reports. I brought them coffee, remembered details about their families, helped them solve problems. I wasn't manipulating them. I genuinely enjoyed these connections. But I was building a network that would prove invaluable. Through casual conversations, I learned that Richard had a pattern of behavior that predated his arrival at North Star. He'd left his previous 2 companies under murky circumstances, always moving on to a better title and higher salary before his misdeeds caught up with him. I also discovered he was having an affair with Vanessa Porter, a VP from our main competitor, Tequera Systems. This explained his mysterious client meetings that appeared on no official calendar. It also represented a massive conflict of interest and potential security breach, given the proprietary information to which Richard had access. My daily routine expanded to include 30 minutes of what I called Richard research. I set up Google alerts for his name. I studied his social media footprint. I learned about his expensive tastes, the yacht club membership, the collection of rare wines, the vacation home in Aspen he could barely afford. Most crucially, I identified his greatest weakness. Richard's entire self-worth was built on his professional reputation. He wasn't just ambitious, he was pathologically fixated on how others perceived him. The designer suits, the name-dropping, the country club membership he stretched his finances to maintain, these weren't just status symbols, they were his identity. 3 months into my campaign, an opportunity presented itself when our company announced a major new initiative. Project Phoenix, a complete overhaul of our core product that would position North Star to compete with industry giants. The CEO designated Richard to lead the financial planning with a team of his choosing. Michael. Richard called me into his office the day after the announcement. I want you on this Phoenix project. You'll report directly to me, separate from your regular duties." "I'm honored," I said, the perfect picture of gratitude. "This is a tremendous opportunity. It's also tremendous pressure," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "The executive team will be watching this project closely. It needs to be flawless." I nodded seriously. I understand completely. What Richard didn't say, but what I understood perfectly, was that he was setting me up as both his workhorse and his potential fall guy. If Phoenix succeeded, he would claim the credit. If it failed, he would need someone to blame. Project Phoenix became my canvas, and Richard my unwitting subject. I worked diligently, producing exceptional financial models and implementation plans. Richard, growing increasingly confident in my loyalty, began to include me in high-level meetings where I gained access to information normally well above my pay grade. In one such meeting, I learned that our CEO, David Harrison, had staked his reputation on Phoenix's success. The board was growing impatient with North Star's market position, and David had convinced them this initiative would be transformative. His job likely depended on its success. This was valuable intelligence. The CEO's personal investment in Project Phoenix meant that any threat to the project would be taken extremely seriously. I filed this information away, continuing to build my case against Richard piece by meticulous piece. 4 months into Project Phoenix, with the launch date approaching, I activated the next phase of my plan. I knew that Richard had been cutting corners on the financial planning, ignoring some significant risk factors that I had repeatedly flagged. He was presenting overly optimistic projections to the executive team, likely hoping to address the problems after securing their buy-in and additional funding. I had documented all of my warnings to him, carefully saving emails where I outlined potential issues and his dismissive responses. But simply revealing these exchanges wouldn't be enough. Richard would claim I hadn't communicated clearly or that I was exaggerating the risks in hindsight. I needed something more definitive. The opportunity came when Richard asked me to prepare the final financial summary for the board presentation. This document would outline expected costs, revenue projections, and ROI timelines. It was the cornerstone of the entire project approval. "I need you to make the numbers sing, Michael," Richard said. "The board needs to see that this is a no-brainer investment." "The current projections are already quite positive," I pointed out cautiously. "The third quarter implementation costs are running higher than expected, but overall—" "I don't want to hear about higher costs," he interrupted. "Find a way to distribute them or reclassify them. The board has a specific ROI threshold, and we need to clear it convincingly." "That would mean manipulating the actual data," I said, making sure my voice contained just the right note of hesitation rather than accusation. Richard gave me a hard stare. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. Just present the information in the most favorable light possible. Everyone does it. It's just part of corporate finance." "I understand," I said, maintaining an expression of slight discomfort mixed with eagerness to please. "I'll see what I can do." That night, I prepared 2 versions of the financial summary. The first contained the manipulated figures that Richard wanted, costs artificially distributed to make quarterly outlays appear smaller. Revenue projections based on best-case scenarios rather than realistic models, and implementation timelines that ignored the technical complexities our development team had repeatedly warned about. The second version contained the accurate figures, meticulously sourced and annotated, showing a project that was still viable but considerably more expensive and slower to yield returns than Richard was promising. I sent Richard the version he wanted, which he approved immediately with a "good work. This is exactly what we need." No review, no questions about my methodology, not even a cursory examination of the assumptions underlying the projections. His carelessness was breathtaking. The next day, I arranged a seemingly chance encounter with Lydia Chen, our chief financial officer, in the company cafe. Lydia was known for her uncompromising ethical standards and attention to detail. She was also one of the few executives who hadn't fallen under Richard's spell. "Michael, isn't it?" she said, as I accidentally bumped into her in the coffee line. "You're on Richard's team for Project Phoenix, right?" "Yes, that's right," I replied with just the right amount of deference. It's been quite the learning experience. We chatted casually about the project, and I carefully expressed enthusiasm while hinting at concerns. The scope is ambitious, I said, especially given the timeline and budget constraints. Lydia's eyes sharpened with interest. She was known for her ability to detect financial irregularities like a bloodhound picks up a scent. Oh, the financial projections I saw looked quite manageable. I allowed myself to appear momentarily uncomfortable. Well, I'm sure Richard has everything under control. He's very confident in our approach. She studied me for a moment. You know, Michael, my door is always open if there's anything specific you think I should be aware of. As CFO, financial integrity is my primary concern. I nodded seriously. I appreciate that, Ms. Chen. Everything is probably fine. It's just... I hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. Some of the assumptions in the model seem optimistic, but I'm relatively new to projects of this scale, so perhaps this is standard practice. There's optimistic, and then there's unrealistic, Lydia said firmly. And at North Star, we strive to be the former without crossing into the latter. I left the conversation there, knowing I had planted a seed. Lydia wouldn't be able to ignore a potential financial irregularity in the company's most important initiative. She would start asking questions, looking more closely at the numbers Richard had been presenting. 2 days later, I received an email from Lydia requesting a meeting to discuss some aspects of the Project Phoenix financial modeling. I forwarded this to Richard immediately, playing the role of the loyal subordinate. She probably just wants to understand the methodology better, I suggested when Richard called me, panic evident in his voice despite his attempt to sound unconcerned. I'm happy to walk her through it if you'd like. No, Richard said quickly. I'll handle it. You just make sure all the documentation supports the figures we submitted. Of course, I agreed. Though she might ask about some of the more aggressive assumptions, like the Q2 revenue projections or the reduced implementation costs. Should I prepare some additional justification for those? There was a pause on the line. What exactly did you say to her, Michael? Nothing specific, I assured him. We just bumped into each other in the cafe. She mentioned Phoenix, and I expressed enthusiasm for the project. Standard small talk. Richard didn't sound entirely convinced, but he had no choice but to believe me. Just make sure the documentation is solid. I'll deal with Lydia. Over the next week, I watched as Richard grew increasingly agitated. He was taking more closed-door meetings, snapping at team members, and staying unusually late at the office. Lydia, it seemed, was not easily deflected. My sources in IT informed me that Richard had asked them to restore some deleted emails, specifically his exchanges with me about the financial projections. Fortunately, I had anticipated this move. The emails he would recover showed me expressing mild concerns, but ultimately deferring to his expertise. Nothing that would implicate him in deliberate misrepresentation, but enough to establish that I had raised flags. The situation escalated when David Harrison, our CEO, called an emergency executive meeting about Project Phoenix. My friend in the executive administrative pool texted me, "Something big happening with Phoenix. CFO presented concerns. Your boss looks like he's about to have a stroke." I maintained my composure, continuing to work diligently while chaos unfolded in the executive suite. Richard didn't return to the office after the meeting. Instead, I received a terse email from the HR director requesting my presence first thing the following morning. That night, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from anticipation. 5 months of careful planning were coming to fruition, and I needed to ensure the final act played out perfectly. I arrived at the HR meeting to find not just the HR director, but also Lydia Chen and David Harrison himself. Richard was conspicuously absent. "Michael," David began gravely, "we need to discuss some serious concerns about the financial projections for Project Phoenix, specifically the discrepancies between the figures presented to the board and what appear to be the actual projections." I adopted an expression of confused concern. "Discrepancies? I'm not sure I understand." Lydia stepped in. "We have reason to believe that the financial summary Richard Walsh presented to the board contained deliberately misleading information. Given your role in preparing these documents, we need to understand your involvement." This was the moment I had been preparing for. I appeared visibly distressed, hesitating before responding. I'm not sure what to say. I did prepare financial projections for Richard, but the final document submitted to the board had significant modifications. What kind of modifications? David asked sharply. I opened my laptop. Perhaps it would be easier if I showed you. I maintain detailed records of all my work. I pulled up the two versions of the financial summary, the accurate one I had initially prepared, and the manipulated one Richard had requested. I raised concerns about these changes. I explained, navigating to the email trail that showed my carefully worded objections. Richard insisted that presenting more favorable numbers was standard practice. He said, and I quote from his email here, that we needed to make the numbers sing and present the information in the most favorable light possible. David and Lydia exchanged glances. When did you become aware that the altered projections had been presented to the board? Lydia asked. Not until recently. I said, the picture of earnest distress. I assumed Richard would incorporate my concerns, or at least disclose the assumptions behind the more optimistic figures. When I realized he had presented them as definitive projections, I was deeply uncomfortable, but I wasn't sure what to do. I looked directly at Lydia. That's why I hinted at my concerns when we spoke in the cafe. I hoped you might look more closely at the numbers without my having to formally report my boss. The HR director took notes furiously as I spoke. Do you have any documentation of the original financial models? David asked. The ones that generated the accurate projections. Of course, I said, opening another folder on my laptop. I maintain backups of all my work, with version histories and timestamps. It's just good practice in financial modeling, given how frequently we need to refer back to previous assumptions. For the next hour, I walked them through the accurate projections, explaining each assumption and data point with calm professionalism. I was careful to emphasize that Project Phoenix was still viable, just not as immediately profitable as Richard had claimed. With proper expectation setting and some timeline adjustments, the project can still deliver significant value. I concluded, it just requires a more measured approach than was originally presented. David leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of anger and relief. So the project isn't doomed, just oversold. Exactly, I confirmed. The core concept is sound. The implementation just requires more time and resources than Richard acknowledged. By the end of the meeting, the picture was clear. Richard had deliberately misrepresented Project Phoenix's financials to secure quick approval and personal acclaim, ignoring valid concerns and manipulating data to tell the story he wanted. I had been the conscientious employee caught in an impossible situation, trying to maintain my professional integrity while respecting the chain of command. We appreciate your candor, Michael, David said as the meeting concluded. This can't have been easy for you. I want you to know that North Star values ethical behavior above all else. You did the right thing by maintaining accurate records and being forthright when asked directly. I nodded solemnly. I just want what's best for the company. We'll need to make some significant adjustments to Project Phoenix based on the accurate projections. Lydia added, would you be willing to help with that process? Your understanding of the financial models would be invaluable. Of course, I agreed readily. Anything I can do to help. As I left the meeting, I maintained my composed, slightly troubled demeanor. Only when I was alone in the elevator did I allow myself a small, satisfied smile. Richard Walsh had dug his own grave. I had simply provided the shovel. Richard was placed on administrative leave that afternoon. By the end of the week, the company announced his departure to pursue other opportunities, the corporate equivalent of being thrown overboard with concrete shoes. In the aftermath, David Harrison personally asked me to take over financial oversight for Project Phoenix. We need someone with both technical skill and uncompromising integrity, he explained. Your handling of this situation demonstrated both. I accepted with appropriate humility, expressing my commitment to getting the project back on track. Within 3 months, I had restructured the financial models, reset expectations with the board, and established a more realistic but still promising timeline for the implementation. Project Phoenix launched successfully, albeit 6 months later than Richard's fantasy projection had promised. A year after Richard's departure, I was promoted to Director of Financial Strategy, a position created specifically for me. The salary was double what I'd earned under Richard, the office larger, the respect of my colleagues genuine rather than coerced. Sometimes I wonder what became of Richard Walsh. LinkedIn shows he took a step down to a middle management position at a smaller company. His profile still boasts of his strategic leadership at North Star, conveniently omitting the circumstances of his departure. I imagine he tells himself that he was the victim of corporate politics, that ungrateful subordinates betrayed him, that the world fails to recognize his brilliance. What he'll never understand is that his downfall wasn't engineered through lies or sabotage. It was orchestrated through something far more powerful, the selective revelation of truth, presented at precisely the right moment. Some might call what I did revenge. I prefer to think of it as justice. Richard built his career by standing on the shoulders of others, taking credit for their work while undermining their advancement. He created a culture of fear rather than collaboration. He valued appearance over substance, self-promotion over genuine achievement. In bringing him down, I didn't just improve my own situation, I liberated an entire department from toxic leadership. Under my direction, the finance team has the lowest turnover rate in the company and the highest satisfaction scores. We deliver consistently excellent work without the drama, backstabbing, and burnout that characterized Richard's reign. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not that revenge is sweet, though I won't deny the satisfaction I felt watching Richard's carefully constructed facade crumble. The real lesson is about patience, documentation, and strategic thinking, about recognizing that sometimes the best way to fight corporate injustice isn't through dramatic confrontation, but through careful preparation and perfectly timed revelation. Would I do it again? In a heartbeat. Not out of malice, but because companies like North Star deserve better than the Richard Walshes of the world. Because talented professionals deserve leaders who lift them up rather than standing on their backs. Because sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to remove the individuals who exploit it. As I sit in my corner office, reviewing the quarterly projections that will soon earn my team well-deserved bonuses, I can't help but smile at the framed motto on my wall, a gift from my team on the anniversary of my promotion. Integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. If only they knew the full story. Richard Walsh taught me the dark arts of corporate politics, not through mentorship, but through his systematic abuse of power. In defeating him, I mastered those arts while maintaining my integrity. It's a delicate balance, navigating the gap between what's officially encouraged and what's actually rewarded in corporate America. But it's a balance I've learned to maintain with precision. 3 years have passed since Richard's downfall, and my position at North Star has only strengthened. Last month, I was invited to join the executive leadership team, the same group that once listened to Richard take credit for my innovations. Now they listen to me directly, and the ideas they implement actually acknowledge their creator. The company culture has shifted too. David Harrison, impressed by how my team flourished post-Richard, has initiated company-wide reforms to identify and address toxic management. They've implemented 360-degree feedback systems, anonymous reporting channels, and more transparent promotion criteria. These changes won't eliminate every Richard Walsh, but they make it harder for such individuals to thrive. Sometimes I cross paths with former colleagues who worked under Richard and have since moved to other departments or companies. They don't know about my role in his departure, no one does, except me, but they often make comments that suggest they've pieced together parts of the story. You know, Michael, one such colleague said during a recent happy hour, I always wondered how Richard managed to hang himself so perfectly. One day he's the golden boy, the next he's cleaning out his desk, almost like someone had been keeping receipts. I just smiled and changed the subject. Let them wonder. The mystery adds to the deterrent effect. Potential Richards throughout the company now tread more carefully, aware that someone might be documenting their misdeeds, waiting for the perfect moment to expose them. Is that manipulative? Perhaps. But in the corporate jungle, sometimes you need to be the quiet predator rather than the vocal prey. Richard's mistake was being too obvious, too arrogant in his predation. He never considered that one of his prey might be methodically setting a trap. Last week, I received a LinkedIn message that gave me pause. It was from Vanessa Porter, the competitor VP with whom Richard had been having an affair. She's now the CEO of her company and was reaching out about a potential partnership with North Star. "I've heard good things about your leadership style," she wrote. "Very different from your predecessor. Perhaps we could discuss mutual opportunities over lunch." I accepted the invitation with professional courtesy, curious about what she might reveal. The lunch was enlightening. Without explicitly acknowledging her past relationship with Richard, Vanessa made it clear that she had no loyalty to him. "Richard had a unique approach to business relationships," she said carefully, swirling her wine. "Always looking for leverage, for angles to exploit. It made him useful in certain contexts, but ultimately unreliable." I maintained a neutral expression. "I found that sustainable business relationships require mutual benefit, not exploitation." She smiled, raising her glass slightly. "Precisely why I wanted to meet with you. Your reputation suggests you understand the difference between winning a battle and winning a war." We parted with a tentative agreement to explore a joint venture, one that would significantly benefit both companies and, not coincidentally, enhance my standing at North Star even further. As I watched Vanessa walk to her car, I reflected on how completely Richard's web of relationships had dissolved after his fall. Even his lover had abandoned any pretense of loyalty, recognizing him as the liability he always was. That evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched for recent information about Richard. A small business news site had a brief profile on him. Walsh Consulting launches to provide strategic financial guidance to emerging tech companies. The accompanying photo showed Richard, hair now more salt than pepper, standing in a small office with a forced smile. The article quoted him. "After years in corporate leadership, I'm excited to share my expertise directly with companies who value experienced guidance." I couldn't help but laugh. Richard Walsh, who had built his career on taking credit for others' expertise, was now reduced to selling the illusion of his own. I doubted his consulting firm would survive long. His primary talent had always been manipulating perception within an established corporate structure, not delivering actual value. For a moment, I felt something close to pity. Richard's need for validation, for status, for power over others, it all seemed so pathetically transparent now. He was just another insecure man hiding behind expensive suits and bombastic claims, terrified that someone would discover his inadequacy. The feeling passed quickly. Richard had damaged careers, created toxic work environments, and stolen opportunities from deserving people throughout his professional life. His current circumstances were the natural consequence of his actions, not something I had inflicted on him. I had merely accelerated the inevitable by removing his ability to continue exploiting North Star and its employees. My phone buzzed with a text from David Harrison. "Board loved the Q3 presentation. They specifically mentioned your transparency about challenges alongside opportunities. This is how we build trust. Drink soon to discuss your thoughts on the VP role opening in January." I smiled as I typed my response. "Appreciate the feedback. Always believe honesty is the best long-term strategy. Drinks sound great. My calendar is open next week." The irony wasn't lost on me. My carefully orchestrated takedown of Richard, built on selective revelations and strategic timing, had established my reputation for transparency and honesty. But unlike Richard, I actually delivered results, built up my team rather than exploiting them, and created value rather than just claiming credit for it. The means may have been somewhat Machiavellian, but the ends were genuinely positive for the company and its people. As I prepare for my likely promotion to vice president, I sometimes reflect on the broader implications of my experience with Richard. Corporate America is full of Richard Walshes, charismatic manipulators who rise by exploiting systemic flaws and others' labor. They survive because most people lack either the awareness to recognize them or the strategic patience to oppose them effectively. I've become quietly vigilant about identifying such individuals at North Star, especially when they're in positions to harm good employees. I don't actively sabotage them. That would make me no better than Richard. but I do create environments where their true nature is more likely to reveal itself naturally. A pointed question in a meeting, a suggestion that claims to be verified, a culture of attribution that makes it harder to steal credit. Is this vigilante justice? Perhaps. But in corporate environments where formal systems often protect the powerful at the expense of the productive, sometimes informal correction is the only justice available. My story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. With each promotion, each expansion of influence, I gain more ability to shape North Star's culture, to create the kind of environment where merit is rewarded, collaboration is valued, and the Richard Walshes of the world find no fertile ground for their parasitic growth. My revenge against Richard was satisfying, certainly, but my true victory isn't in his downfall. It's in the better workplace I've helped create in his absence, one where talent rises based on contribution rather than self-promotion, where ideas are attributed to their creators, and where leadership means elevating others rather than climbing on their backs. In the end, the art of revenge isn't about destruction. It's about restoration, removing what's toxic to make room for what's healthy. Richard learned this too late. I learned it just in time. 6 months after my promotion to Vice President of Financial Strategy, I received an unexpected email. The sender was William Chen, Richard's replacement at the company he'd joined after leaving North Star. The subject line was simple: advice requested. I hope this email finds you well. William wrote, "We haven't met, but I recently took over Richard Walsh's position at Meridian Tech. The transition has been challenging. Several team members have suggested I speak with you. As you worked closely with Richard at North Star, I'm trying to understand the department I've inherited and would appreciate any insights you might be willing to share. Perhaps coffee sometime next week." I stared at the message, torn between amusement and concern. What exactly had Richard done at Meridian? And what were William's intentions in reaching out? Curiosity won out, and I agreed to meet him at a cafe equidistant from our respective offices. William turned out to be a serious young man with thoughtful eyes and a deliberate manner of speaking. After exchanging pleasantries, he got straight to the point. "I'm going to be frank with you, Mr. Turner. I inherited a mess. The financial department at Meridian is in disarray. Documentation is missing or incomplete. Team morale is abysmal. And there are some irregularities in the reporting that have me concerned." I nodded, unsurprised. Richard has a particular management style. William gave a short, humorless laugh. That's putting it mildly. 3 team members quit the week after he left. They described a culture of fear, favoritism, and, I'm quoting here, creative accounting practices. "What exactly are you looking for from me, William?" I asked carefully. He leaned forward. "Context, mainly. I need to understand if what I'm seeing is just Richard's mess to clean up, or if there's something more systemic I should be concerned about. The team members who suggested I talk to you implied you might have special insight into how Richard operates." The conversation that followed was illuminating. Without explicitly revealing my role in Richard's departure from North Star, I shared my observations about his management approach, his tendency to manipulate financial data, and his pattern of claiming credit while deflecting blame. William listened intently, occasionally making notes. "This confirms my suspicions," he said finally. "The question now is how deep the problem goes and whether I need to bring in outside auditors. If I were in your position," I offered, "I would quietly secure copies of all financial documentation first, before anyone realizes you're investigating. Richard tends to inspire significant loyalty in a few key subordinates, usually those who benefit from his creative approaches." William's eyes widened slightly. "That's eerily accurate. There's a senior analyst who practically worshipped Richard and has been subtly obstructing my review efforts." We parted with a handshake and William's sincere thanks. As I walked back to my office, I reflected on how Richard's patterns remained consistent across organizations. He was a corporate parasite who infected each host in the same way, causing similar symptoms before moving on to the next victim. 3 weeks later, business news sites reported that Meridian Tech had disclosed accounting irregularities discovered during an internal review and had parted ways with several employees. Richard Walsh was not mentioned by name, but his consulting business website went offline the same day. I sent William a brief message. Saw the news. If you need any further insights during your reconstruction phase, I'm happy to help. His response was equally brief. Thanks. Might take you up on that. Still uncovering layers. This pattern of Richard's destruction, followed by my subtle involvement in the cleanup, was becoming something of a secondary career. I wasn't actively pursuing opportunities to expose him, but neither was I declining them when they arose. There was a certain poetic justice in helping repair the damage he caused, especially when it further cemented my reputation as a problem solver and person of integrity. My primary focus remained on my work at North Star, where my influence continued to grow. The company was thriving under leadership that valued substance over showmanship, with our stock price reaching an all-time high following 3 consecutive quarters of exceeding projections. Realistic projections, not the fantasy numbers Richard used to present. David Harrison had become something of a mentor to me, often seeking my input on strategic decisions beyond my formal scope of responsibility. You have good judgment, he told me during one of our regular lunch meetings. You see around corners in a way most people don't. If only he knew how accurate that assessment was. My experience with Richard had honed my ability to anticipate threats, identify vulnerabilities, and neutralize problems before they fully materialized. I applied these skills not toward personal vendettas, but toward protecting the company culture we'd worked so hard to build. One Friday evening, as I was preparing to leave the office, my assistant informed me that someone was waiting to see me. He doesn't have an appointment, she explained apologetically. He said his name is Jack Foster and that you'd want to speak with him. The name meant nothing to me, but I was intrigued enough to delay my departure. The man who entered my office was in his early 60s, with a weathered face and penetrating blue eyes that evaluated me with unnerving intensity. Mr. Turner, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I've heard a great deal about you. All good things, I hope, I replied with a professional smile, gesturing for him to take a seat. What can I do for you, Mr. Foster? He settled into the chair across from my desk. I'm here about Richard Walsh. My expression remained neutral, but internally, my guard went up. Richard hasn't worked at North Star for several years. I'm aware, Foster said. I'm also aware of the circumstances of his departure and his subsequent difficulties at Meridian Tech. I'm not sure what this has to do with me, I said carefully. Foster's smile didn't reach his eyes. Let's not waste time with pretenses. Mr. Turner, I know what you did. The carefully maintained records, the strategic revelation of information, the perfectly timed conversations with key executives, very elegantly executed. My pulse quickened, but I kept my composure. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Richard's issues at North Star were of his own making. The company simply discovered financial misrepresentations he had made. Of course, Foster agreed too readily. Just as his problems at Meridian were also of his own making, and at Westbridge Systems before North Star, and at FinCor before that. Now he had my full attention. You seem to know a great deal about Richard's career history. I hired him at FinCor. I was his mentor. Foster leaned back, studying me. Richard has many flaws, but his greatest was never learning the lesson you mastered. True power comes from elevating others, not exploiting them. He creates enemies everywhere he goes, while you create allies. Why are you here, Mr. Foster? I asked directly. Professional curiosity. Primarily, I've been tracking Richard's career and his downfalls for some time. Your handling of him was by far the most sophisticated I've witnessed. Most people try direct confrontation, complaints to HR, or simple sabotage. You understood that the most effective weapon against someone like Richard is his own actions, properly documented and strategically revealed. I remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his assessment. Foster continued, I'm not here to expose you, Mr. Turner. Quite the opposite. I'm here to offer you an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? I run a specialized consulting firm that helps companies identify and address toxic leadership before it causes significant damage. We use data analytics, cultural assessments, and strategic interventions to neutralize threats while maintaining organizational stability. Someone with your insights and abilities would be an asset to our team. The irony was almost too perfect. This man was essentially offering to pay me to do what I'd done to Richard, but on a larger scale and with institutional backing. "I'm happy at North Star," I said. Foster nodded. "As you should be. You've built something impressive here. My offer isn't for immediate consideration. It's for when you're ready for a new challenge." He placed a business card on my desk. The corporate world is full of Richard Walshes, Mr. Turner. Some are just better at hiding their nature than others. Think about how many careers are destroyed, how much talent is wasted, how many lives are damaged by such individuals every day. The conversation stayed with me long after Foster left. His card remained on my desk for weeks as I considered the implications of his offer. There was something undeniably appealing about the idea of systematically identifying and neutralizing toxic leaders before they could cause widespread harm. It aligned with my values in a way I hadn't expected. But for now, my work at North Star remains fulfilling. The company continues to thrive under ethical leadership. My team is productive, innovative, and genuinely happy. We're creating real value, both financially and culturally. As for Richard Walsh, I occasionally hear rumors. He's taken another mid-level position at a smaller firm. He's trying to rebuild his consulting business. He's blaming his failures on jealous colleagues and unreasonable expectations. The specifics change, but the pattern remains the same. Richard hasn't learned, and likely never will. I, on the other hand, continue to evolve. My experience with Richard taught me that corporate justice often requires patience, documentation, and strategic thinking rather than direct confrontation. It showed me that some battles are won not through force, but through carefully orchestrated revelation. Most importantly, it demonstrated that true leadership success comes not from claiming credit, but from creating environments where everyone can contribute and be recognized for their contributions. Is that revenge? Perhaps. Or perhaps it's something more profound, a fundamental reshaping of how power and recognition are distributed in corporate environments. Either way, I sleep well at night knowing that my actions, while perhaps morally complex, have ultimately created more good than harm. Jack Foster's card still sits in my desk drawer. Maybe someday I'll call him. There's something appealing about the idea of bringing Richard Walsh-type executives to justice on a larger scale. For now, though, I'm content building something positive at North Star, knowing that I've not only avenged myself, but created a lasting legacy of ethical leadership that will far outlast the memory of Richard's brief, destructive tenure. The art of revenge, I've learned, isn't about destruction at all. It's about transformation of systems, of cultures, and ultimately, of oneself. In overcoming Richard, I discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed. In rebuilding what he tried to destroy, I found my true professional purpose. And in that sense, I owe Richard Walsh a debt of gratitude. His attempt to break me only made me more powerful than he could possibly imagine. 3 years after my meeting with Jack Foster, I finally called the number on his card. The decision wasn't impulsive, but the culmination of months of reflection following a significant change at North Star. David Harrison had announced his retirement, triggering a succession race for the CEO position. As a senior vice president with a strong track record, I was among the top candidates. The board conducted a thorough selection process, and the final decision came down to me and Philip Donovan, the chief operating officer. Philip was a capable executive with impressive credentials. He was also, I had begun to notice, showing subtle signs of Richard-like tendencies, taking credit for subordinates' work, manipulating information to enhance his reputation, building loyalty through favoritism rather than merit. These behaviors were skillfully disguised behind a veneer of collegiality and corporate speak, but my experiences had given me a finely tuned radar for such tactics. When Philip was announced as the new CEO, I congratulated him publicly while privately beginning to document the patterns I was observing. Old habits die hard, and self-protection had become second nature. 3 months into Philip's tenure, my concerns were validated when he reorganized the executive team, strategically sidelining anyone who had supported my candidacy while promoting his loyalists. My role wasn't eliminated, my results were too consistently excellent for that, but I was shifted to a newly created position that removed me from core strategic decisions. The move was presented as a promotion, complete with a modest salary increase and an impressive new title, Executive Vice President of Financial Innovation. In reality, it was an elegant form of executive purgatory. I recognized the playbook immediately. It was Richard Walsh all over again, just executed with more sophistication and political savvy. The difference was that this time I had the experience, resources, and connections to respond more effectively. For 6 months, I played the good soldier, expressing enthusiasm for my new role while methodically building my case. I documented every instance where Philip misrepresented results, took unearned credit, or made decisions that prioritized short-term optics over long-term value. I maintained a network of allies throughout the organization who kept me informed about decisions being made in rooms I no longer had access to. Then came the quarterly earnings call where Philip presented projections that I knew to be fundamentally misleading. The numbers weren't technically false, but they relied on assumptions that any experienced financial professional would recognize as fantasy. The stock jumped on the optimistic outlook, and Philip was hailed as a visionary leader transforming North Star's prospects. That evening, I called Jack Foster. "I've been expecting your call," he said when his assistant put me through. Philip Donovan's appointment as CEO made it somewhat inevitable. I wasn't entirely surprised that Foster knew about North Star's leadership change, but his knowledge of the specific dynamics gave me pause. "You've been keeping tabs on me, on situations likely to benefit from our services," he corrected gently. North Star's leadership transition had several red flags that caught our attention. Philip's history at his previous companies follows certain patterns we monitor. 2 days later, I met Foster at his firm's offices, a surprisingly modest suite in a mid-tier office building. The company name on the door, Corporate Integrity Partners, was generic enough to attract little attention. Inside, however, was a sophisticated operation with a team of analysts, behavioral psychologists, and former corporate executives who specialized in what Foster called ethical intervention. "We don't consider ourselves corporate vigilantes," Foster explained as he showed me around. "We provide a correction mechanism for situations where traditional governance has failed. Most boards and executive teams genuinely want ethical leadership, but they often lack the tools to identify sophisticated manipulators or the leverage to address problems once identified." Over the next few hours, Foster and his team outlined how they operated. They never initiated investigations without a formal client, usually a board member, major investor, or a C-suite executive with legitimate concerns. They used data analytics to identify patterns of misrepresentation or manipulation. They built cases methodically, focusing on impact to shareholders and company value rather than personal grievances. Most importantly, they prioritized rehabilitation over removal when possible. "Our goal isn't to destroy careers," Foster emphasized. "It's to correct behavior and protect organizational health. Sometimes that requires leadership changes, but often it can be achieved through structured intervention and governance reforms." By the end of our meeting, I had a decision to make. Foster had offered me a senior position with his firm, leveraging my financial expertise and experience with toxic leadership to help other companies facing similar challenges. The role would require leaving North Star, a company I had helped build and still cared about deeply. "Take some time to think about it," Foster advised. "This isn't a decision to make rashly. In the meantime, we'd be interested in taking North Star as a client if you believe Philip's leadership presents a genuine risk to the company's value and culture." I spent the weekend considering my options. Leaving North Star felt like abandoning a home I had helped build. Staying meant watching Philip potentially dismantle the culture of integrity we had worked so hard to establish. Becoming Foster's client offered a third path, one that might save North Star while requiring me to step back from direct involvement. On Monday morning, I requested a meeting with Eleanor Winters, the board chairperson and someone I had worked with closely during my years at North Star. Eleanor was a shrewd businesswoman with impeccable ethical standards and a fiduciary commitment to shareholders that transcended personal relationships. This is a serious conversation. Michael, she said after I had outlined my concerns about Philip's leadership and the misleading projections from the recent earnings call. You understand the implications of what you're sharing? I do, I confirmed. I've documented everything meticulously and am prepared to stand behind every statement I've made. This isn't about my role or position. It's about North Star's long-term health and the culture we've built over the years. Eleanor studied me thoughtfully. The board was divided on the CEO selection. Philip had more traditional credentials, but several of us had concerns about aspects of his leadership style. Your track record of integrity was actually a significant factor in your favor. This was the first confirmation I'd received that the decision had been contentious. I'm not here to relitigate the CEO selection, I assured her. I'm here because I believe the board may not have complete information about how Philip is currently managing the company. After further discussion, Eleanor agreed to initiate a confidential review of the concerns I had raised, particularly the financial projections from the earnings call. She asked if I knew of any independent firms that specialized in this type of analysis. As a matter of fact, I said, I recently became aware of a firm called Corporate Integrity Partners that has relevant expertise. 2 months later, Corporate Integrity Partners presented their findings to North Star's board in a closed session. Their report was comprehensive, data-driven, and devastating. They had identified multiple instances of financial misrepresentation, strategic decisions that created short-term gains at the expense of long-term value, and a pattern of leadership behaviors that were already causing an exodus of top talent. Philip Donovan was removed as CEO following an emergency board meeting. The press release cited strategic differences and announced an interim leadership structure while a search for a permanent replacement was conducted. Eleanor called me the day after the announcement. The board would like to discuss the CEO position with you. Michael, your assessment of the situation proved accurate, and your handling of it demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity we need in leadership. I thanked her for the consideration, but explained that I had decided to pursue a different path. North Star will always be important to me, but I believe I can have a broader impact in a new role I've been offered. 2 weeks later, I joined Corporate Integrity Partners as a managing director, specializing in financial ethics and leadership assessment. My first major project was helping a Fortune 500 company identify and address patterns of manipulation in their European division, a situation with remarkable similarities to what I had experienced with Richard years earlier. As I settled into my new role, I occasionally reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Richard Walsh had unwittingly given me the education I needed to recognize and address toxic leadership on a systemic level. Philip Donovan had provided the catalyst that pushed me to leverage that knowledge beyond a single company. My work now focuses on creating corporate environments where the Richard Walshes and Philip Donovans of the world cannot thrive, where transparency, attribution, and ethical behavior are rewarded while manipulation and credit stealing are quickly identified and addressed. Is this the revenge I originally sought against Richard? Not exactly. It's evolved into something more meaningful, a mission to transform corporate culture itself. The ultimate revenge against toxic leadership isn't personal destruction, but systemic change that makes such behavior unsustainable. Richard Walsh continues his cycle of briefly rising before inevitably falling, his reputation increasingly tarnished with each iteration. Last I heard, he was working for a struggling startup, still blaming others for his failures, still unable to recognize the fundamental flaws in his approach to leadership. Meanwhile, I've found purpose in helping companies build cultures where merit is recognized, collaboration is valued, and leaders understand that their legacy isn't measured by personal accolades, but by the success of those they elevate. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's moving beyond, using the painful experience as fuel for transformation rather than destruction. Richard taught me how corporate power can be abused. In response, I've dedicated my career to ensuring that such abuse becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. That's not just revenge, that's revolution. And revolutions, unlike revenge, create lasting change. The quarterly meeting of Corporate Integrity Partners' senior team always began with a review of ongoing cases. As I presented the status of my current projects, Jack Foster interrupted with an unexpected announcement. Before we continue, I should inform everyone that we've received an inquiry about a potential new client. Normally I wouldn't mention this at this stage, but given the circumstances, I wanted to discuss it with the full team. He paused, looking directly at me. The company is Techware Systems. The contact is their new board chair, Vanessa Porter. A ripple of recognition passed through the room. Several of my colleagues glanced my way, familiar with the North Star saga and Vanessa's peripheral role in it. Interesting, I said, maintaining a neutral tone. Did she request me specifically for the engagement? Foster nodded. She did. She also mentioned that the situation involves their recently hired CFO, Richard Walsh. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. Richard working at Techware, North Star's longtime competitor, Vanessa, his former affair partner, now his boss, and now she was reaching out to me through a firm known for addressing toxic leadership. The circle was completing itself in a way that seemed almost too perfectly orchestrated. What exactly is she concerned about? I asked. Financial misrepresentation, primarily, Foster replied. According to Miss Porter, their board approved a major expansion based on projections that are now proving to be wildly optimistic. She used those exact words. I couldn't help but smile slightly. Richard's playbook remained consistent, even if his victims changed. I assume you've reminded Ms. Porter about our conflict of interest policy. Given my history with both her and Richard, I wouldn't be the appropriate lead on this engagement. Foster nodded. I have. She understands you wouldn't be directly involved, but expressed hope that you might consult on the approach given your unique insights into the situation. The meeting continued with discussions of other cases, but my mind kept returning to the Techware situation. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. Vanessa Porter was too shrewd to have hired Richard without understanding the risks. Something else was happening here, a game within a game. After the meeting, Foster invited me to his office for a private conversation. You're not considering taking the Techware case, are you? I asked as soon as his door closed. That depends, he replied, settling behind his desk. What's your assessment of Vanessa Porter's motivation in reaching out to us? I considered the question carefully. Vanessa is calculating in everything she does. If she hired Richard despite knowing his history, she did so for a specific purpose. And if she's reaching out to us now, that's also deliberate. A trap, Foster suggested? Not necessarily. More likely a controlled experiment. I paced as I organized my thoughts. Vanessa may have hired Richard as a test, giving him just enough rope to reveal his nature, but not enough to cause significant damage. Now she's bringing in external experts to document the results and provide cover for whatever action she's already decided to take. Foster nodded slowly. Using us to legitimize a predetermined outcome. Exactly. Vanessa doesn't need our help identifying Richard's manipulations. She's perfectly capable of recognizing those herself. What she wants is an independent third party to validate what she already knows, providing protection from potential litigation or shareholder concerns. So we'd essentially be pawns in her game. Foster frowned. That's not how we operate. No, I agreed. But there might be a more interesting approach here. What if we accept the engagement but expand its scope? Instead of just focusing on Richard, we could conduct a comprehensive leadership ethics assessment across Techware's executive team, including Vanessa herself. Foster's expression shifted from concern to interest. Turn the observer into the observed. Precisely. If Vanessa is using Richard as a disposable tool to advance her own agenda, that represents its own form of toxic leadership. Different from Richard's methods, certainly, but potentially just as damaging to organizational health in the long run. Foster leaned back, considering. It's risky. Vanessa could simply decline the expanded scope. She could, I acknowledged, but that in itself would be revealing. And if she accepts, we have the opportunity to address not just the symptom, Richard, but potentially a deeper pattern of manipulation at Techware's leadership level. The next day, Foster called Vanessa to discuss the potential engagement. As we had discussed, he expressed interest in taking on the case but recommended a broader assessment of leadership ethics throughout the executive team, positioning it as standard practice to ensure comprehensive results. To my surprise, Vanessa agreed readily. That makes perfect sense, she told Foster. We want to ensure we're addressing any systemic issues, not just individual behaviors. Her quick acceptance only reinforced my suspicion that she had a larger game in mind. 3 weeks later, our team began the techware assessment. True to our agreement, I wasn't directly involved, but provided background guidance to the team based on my experience with both Richard and Vanessa. The initial findings confirmed exactly what we expected. Richard was indeed misrepresenting financial projections, taking credit for others' work, and creating a climate of fear within his department. What was more interesting, however, were the patterns that emerged around Vanessa's leadership. She had systematically placed individuals like Richard in key positions throughout the organization, people with talent but significant character flaws that made them dependent on her protection. She would let them operate with minimal oversight until they inevitably overreached, then step in as the corporate savior, removing the problem they created while consolidating her own power. It was a sophisticated form of toxic leadership, less direct than Richard's approach, but potentially more damaging to long-term organizational health. Vanessa wasn't stealing credit or manipulating numbers herself. Instead, she was creating an environment where such behavior was tacitly encouraged, giving her plausible deniability while maintaining ultimate control. When our team presented the preliminary findings to TechWare's board, the reaction was mixed. Some directors were primarily concerned with Richard's obvious misdeeds, while others began asking more pointed questions about the leadership culture that had enabled him. Vanessa maintained her composure throughout, but I was told her expression darkened noticeably when the discussion turned to systemic issues rather than remaining focused on Richard. A week later, TechWare announced Richard's departure, another mutual decision to pursue other opportunities in his increasingly checkered career. But contrary to Vanessa's likely expectations, the board also established an independent governance committee to implement our recommended reforms, including more transparent financial reporting processes and stronger protections for employees who raised ethical concerns. 3 months after the engagement concluded, I received a lunch invitation from Vanessa. Curious about her perspective on how events had unfolded, I accepted. We met at an upscale restaurant halfway between our respective offices. You played that very well, she said after we had ordered, skipping any pretense of small talk. I underestimated you. Again. I'm not sure what you mean, I replied, maintaining an expression of polite interest. She laughed. Of course you do. I brought in your firm to handle Richard, and you turned it into an examination of my leadership. Elegant. Richard would have just tried to destroy me directly. Is that what you did with him? Brought him in to self-destruct? Vanessa sipped her water. Richard has always been useful in specific contexts. He creates messes that need cleaning up, which creates opportunities for those prepared to do the cleaning. She studied me. We're not so different, you and I. We both recognize how to use people like Richard to advance our objectives. There's a fundamental difference, I countered. I don't set people up to fail. I don't create toxic environments to give myself problems to solve. Don't you? She challenged. Your entire career has been built on identifying and addressing toxic leadership. Without the Richards of the world, what would you do? The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Had I become dependent on toxic leaders to give my work meaning? Was I, in some perverse way, as invested in their existence as Vanessa was? The difference, I said finally, is that I'm working to create systems where the Richards become extinct. You're breeding them. Vanessa smiled. And yet, here we both are, having lunch at a nice restaurant, successful in our respective fields. The universe doesn't seem particularly concerned with our different approaches. As our food arrived, the conversation shifted to more neutral topics, industry trends, mutual acquaintances, predictions about the economy. Vanessa was charming, insightful, and utterly unrepentant about her methods. In another context, I might have admired her strategic mind. As we parted outside the restaurant, she offered a parting observation. You know, Michael, the people like Richard believe power comes from controlling others. People like you believe it comes from helping others. The truth is probably somewhere in between. I watched her walk away, her words lingering. Was she right? Had my quest to address the toxic leadership simply become another form of control, dressed in more palatable language? The question stayed with me as I returned to my office. On my desk was a handwritten note from a former North Star colleague who had recently joined one of our client companies. "Just wanted to say thank you." It read, "The culture you helped create here has made it possible for people like me to do our best work without fear. You've changed more lives than you know." Perhaps Vanessa was partially right. Perhaps power always involves some degree of control, but intention matters. Impact matters. Creating environments where people can thrive without manipulation or fear, that matters most of all. Richard Walsh's story continues to unfold, though he's increasingly a peripheral character in my narrative. Last I heard, he had taken a position with a small family office, his once meteoric career trajectory now a cautionary tale in corporate circles. My own path continues to evolve. Corporate Integrity Partners has grown significantly, with offices in 3 countries and a client list that includes some of the world's largest companies. We've refined our methodologies, expanded our focus beyond individual toxic leaders to address systemic conditions that enable them, and published research that has influenced governance standards across multiple industries. The art of revenge, I've discovered, isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about transforming systems so that their harmful behaviors become obsolete. Richard Walsh taught me how power can corrupt. Vanessa Porter showed me how corruption can be strategically deployed. Together, they helped me define my own approach to corporate leadership, one focused on creating environments where ethical behavior is rewarded and manipulation cannot thrive. Is that revenge? Perhaps not in the conventional sense, but watching organizations transform into places where the Richard Walshes of the world have no fertile ground, that's a satisfaction far deeper and more lasting than any personal vendetta could provide. The true art of revenge isn't about getting even, it's about getting better.